Syria, Iran, Iraq. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup.
To shape Israel's environment, to take down, to damage, to fragment the countries around Israel.
Today, the United States must destroy the same regime because a nuclear-armed Saddam will place the security of our entire world at risk.
Syria, Libya, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, and Lebanon. Systematically, the United States has done Netanyahu's bidding for almost 30 years now. I think it's interesting, as you pointed out, the U.S. calls HTS a terrorist group, but obviously the U.S. is part of what's happening these days. For Israel, this is standard fare. Overthrow governments in the neighborhood, expand the war, draw the United States in, and the U.S. is always available at Israel's behest to play games and expand wars. And wars are not fought out of sentiment. Wars are fought with money and armaments. And therefore, you can always find major powers behind these wars. And in the case of Syria, it was Obama in 2011 who tasked the CIA to overthrow Assad. This was at Israel's behest, in my understanding and interpretation. But it required billions of dollars from the U.S. It's really fascinating to go back 1996 with Netanyahu, who wrote a book called Fighting Terrorism. He says, you know, there's Hamas, there's Hezbollah, they oppose Israel. It's not good for us to fight them directly. That won't work. What we need to do is topple the governments that back them. So what we need is regime change throughout the Middle East. And he actually gave a long list of 7 countries that included Syria, Libya, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, and Lebanon. And systematically, the United States has done Netanyahu's bidding for almost 30 years now, going to war with every one of them, except for the big one that Netanyahu so much longs for, which is the war directly between the United States and Iran. But the U.S. went to war with Syria in 2011. The United States overthrew Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. It's interesting, Piers, to go back to 2002. This is after 9/11, of course, to watch Netanyahu as being the lead cheerleader for the U.S. to overthrow Saddam Hussein.
Israel acted because we understood, that a nuclear-armed Saddam would place our very survival at risk. And today, the United States must destroy the same regime because a nuclear-armed Saddam will place the security of our entire world at risk. Once one of the principal regimes in the terror network has nuclear weapons, you cannot prevent the terror network from having nuclear weapons. Did Israel launch that preemptive strike because Saddam had committed a specific act of terror against us? Did we coordinate our actions with the international community? Did we condition this operation on the approval of the United Nations? No, of course not.
The U.S. invaded in March of 2003 with a massive bombing campaign and paved the way for ground troops.
One of Israel's main newspapers reported bluntly, the war in Iraq was conceived by 25 neoconservative intellectuals, most of them Jewish, who are pushing President Bush to change the course of history. The article gave what it termed a partial list. U.S. governmental officials Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, Elliot Abrams, journalists William Crystal and Charles Krauthammer, describing them as mutual friends who cultivate one another. The article included an interview with New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, who was quoted as saying, "It's the war the neoconservatives wanted. It's the war the neoconservatives marketed. Those people had an idea to sell when September 11th came, and they sold it. Oh boy, did they sell it." The article continued, Friedman laughs. I could give you the names of 25 people, all of whom are at this moment within a 5-block radius of this office, who, if you had exiled them to a desert island a year and a half ago, the Iraq War would not have happened. Another Israeli newspaper described how some of these individuals, high American officials, gave Israeli leaders tips on how to manage American actions and influence U.S. congressmen. Pearl, Feith, and their fellow strategists are walking a fine line between their loyalty to American governments and Israeli interests. American author, peace activist, and former CIA analyst Kathleen Christensen discussed the situation in a 2002 article. Although much has been written about the neocons who dot the Bush administration, their ties to Israel have generally been treated very gingerly. The Bush administration, she wrote, was peppered with people who have long records of activism on behalf of Israel in the United States, of policy advocacy in Israel, and of promoting an agenda for Israel often at odds with existing U.S. policy. These people, she wrote, who can fairly be called Israeli loyalists, are now at all levels of government, from desk officers at the Defense Department to the Deputy Secretary level at both State and Defense, as well as on the National Security Council staff and in the Vice President's office.
Now we have a treasure trove of documents coming out that this was really a war on Israel's behalf. Everything about the weapons of mass destruction was phony, known to be phony inside the U.S. government, but this was the argument that was given, and Netanyahu was there in Washington telling him it'll be just great if you take out Saddam Hussein. It's going to topple all the rest of the governments. The idea was, incidentally, that Saddam would be toppled and then the U.S. military would go right into Syria right away.
They said there are weapons of mass destruction. Bottom line, there were no weapons of mass destruction. The Iraqis did not knock down. It was not Saddam Hussein that knocked down the World Trade Center.
We started this because Syria was on Netanyahu's list. And it was literally a list, by the way. We know from this remarkable story of the former NATO commander, Wesley Clark, the supreme commander of NATO.
Yeah, no.
Wesley Clark went into the Pentagon, after 9/11, and he was given the list of the 7 countries that we were going to take out in 5 years. This was Netanyahu's list.
So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. I sat on this information for a long time, for about 6 or 8 months. I was so stunned by this I couldn't begin to talk about it. And I couldn't believe it would really be true, but that's actually what happened. These people took control of the policy in the United States. And I realized then, it came back to me, a 1991 meeting I had with Paul Wolfowitz. In 2001 he was Deputy Secretary of Defense, but in 1991 he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. It's the number 3 position in the Pentagon. And I had gone to see him when I was a 1-star general. I was commanding the National Training Center. Scooter Libby came to the door. I met Scooter for the first time, and he brought me in. And I said to Paul, and this is 1991, I said, "Mr. Secretary, you must be pretty happy with the performance of the troops in Desert Storm." And he said, "Well, yeah," he said, but not really. He said, "because the truth is we should have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and we didn't." And this was just after the Shia uprising in March of 91, which we had provoked, and then we kept our troops on the sidelines and didn't intervene. And he said, "But one thing we did learn," he said, "we learned that we can use our military in the region, in the Middle East, and the Soviets won't stop us." He said, "And we've got about 5 or 10 years to clean up those old Soviet client regimes. Syria, Iran, Iraq. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half-dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control. It went back to those comments in 1991. Now, did anybody ever tell you that? Was there a national dialogue on this? Did senators and congressmen stand up and denounce this plan? Was there a full-fledged American debate on it? Absolutely not. And there still isn't.
Trump's executive order targets 7 countries: Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Iran. Well, how did these countries become countries of concern? That was under Barack Obama and Congress and Dianne Feinstein. Legislation in 2015 and 2016 made those same countries countries of interest. That's where Trump got those countries. It turns out that these same countries, except for one, had been targeted in previous plans. In 2001, all of them except for one were targeted to be taken down. There was a 1996 plan on behalf of Israel called A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm. This was a position paper, a strategy paper for Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli leader, written by American officials. The realm they were talking about protecting was Israel, not the United States. And in it, they specifically talk about the need to shape Israel's environment, to take down, to damage, to fragment the countries around Israel. We invaded Iraq, largely on behalf of Israel. This is written about openly in the Israeli press. You go back to 1982. There's something called usually we call it the Yunon Plan, Oded Yunon. The full title was A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s. This was published by the World Zionist Organization. It called for the dissolution and downfall of existing Arab states. It specifically mentions Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Sudan, Libya, Lebanon. The entire Arabian Peninsula is a natural candidate for dissolution, breaking Egypt down. If Egypt falls apart, countries like Libya, Sudan, or even the more distant states will not continue to exist in their present form and will join the downfall and dissolution of Egypt. Quote, Iraq, rich in oil, is guaranteed as a candidate for Israel's targets. Its dissolution is even more important for us than that of Syria. Iraq is stronger than Syria. In the short run, it is Iraqi power which constitutes the greatest threat to Israel. Every kind of inter-Arab confrontation will assist us in the short run and will shorten the way to the more important aim of breaking up Iraq into denominations as in Syria and in Lebanon. Let's look at 1954. This is again online. This is a book. From Israel's earliest days, there were plans to dismember the Arab world, defeat the Arab national movement, and create puppet regimes. Ben-Gurion talked about a plan for putting a Christian in charge of Lebanon and breaking Lebanon up. And they've done that to these regimes. We've done it. We've done it. WikiLeaks divulged one of Hillary's emails in which he said the best way to help Israel is to help the people of Syria overthrow the regime of Bashar Assad. So here's Syria. Here's what's been done to Syria. 300,000 at least are dead. And then, as the UK Guardian very honestly said, the disorder and chaos that we see now in Syria would not be an unfortunate side effect of war with Iraq, but a sign that everything is going according to plan. That was the plan. And now we have tragedy growing in Europe. Deaths there. France. But before this picture was this picture of a Syrian boy. And before that little Syrian boy was this Palestinian boy in Gaza. All of this is going on and on and on and on and on with our tax money. And now the same groups are targeting Iran. This was one of the countries named under these various plans, beginning with Ben-Gurion through Yunon Oded, through the project of the New American Century. All of these named Iran. Iraq's taken care of. Syria's taken care of. Egypt's bought off. Jordan's bought off. Iran is left. So now we had a newspaper advertisement in the New York Times put in by all of these Israel advocacy organizations demonizing Iran. The media give us a lot of misinformation about Iran. But Iran has children too. They also play on beaches. It's time to stop what's going on.